I'm Elizabeth Curtis, and I'm really excited to welcome all of you here today. We're going to be hearing from Howard Ross. Howard is a business consultant who's been working for over 25 years in the area of leadership, diversity, inclusion, organizational transformation, and we're really lucky to have him here today at Google. You may have seen his recent article in the New York Times or perhaps heard him on NPR where he's a regular guest. He's the author of 2 books, and I'm really excited that he's going to be giving us a deep dive today into his most recent book, Everyday Bias. How the session is going to run is Howard's going to come up, share a few words with us, and then we'll open things up to Q&A. So with that, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everybody. Really happy to be here. I want to start with a story. I was in Jackson, Mississippi about a year ago. I was working with some folks at Jackson State University, which is a historically black college. And they were working with the faculty and the deans down there. And I had to fly from Jackson to New York City through Memphis that night to work with another client. And I got to the Memphis airport in time for the last flight out. I got to the gate, and as soon as I got to the gate, a woman gate attendant comes on and she says, "Ladies and gentlemen, there'll be a 45-minute delay." As soon as the words came out of her mouth, I hear this voice boom out from behind me. "You talking to us, lady?" And I turn around, and there's this guy sitting behind me who I would best describe as Santa Claus with an attitude. Older white guy, white beard, white hair, well-fed, wearing overalls and a flannel shirt, carrying a car magazine in his hand. So I had the guy pegged, and I kind of chuckled to myself and went about my business working on my computer, preparing a talk that I was giving the next week. And comes time to get on the airplane 45 minutes later, and I get to my seat, and sure enough, who's sitting next to me but angry Santa Claus? So we did the nod. Those of you who travel a lot know what I'm talking about, this sort of thing. And we went about our business, took off, and I'm working on my computer. He's reading his magazine. And that's the way it went until we got to New York, and it was time for our initial descent. And then we closed computers, and as travelers know, this is the time when airplane chat starts, because it's now safe to get into a conversation. You're not going to get roped into 2 hours. And I turned to him and I say, "What's taking you to New York?" And he says, "I have a professional meeting." I said, "Really, what do you do?" He says, "I'm a radiologist." So boom, there goes that picture. Then I say, "Well, what are you working on?" He says, actually, he gets very animated. He says, "We're doing this very cool stuff with functional magnetic resonating imagery where we're looking at the brain and we're actually able to watch the brain and figure out how different parts of the brain respond when people interact with different kinds of people." In other words, he's studying exactly what I'm the most interested in. And had I not pegged him as Angry Santa the car mechanic, I probably could have learned more in a 2-hour conversation with him in preparation for my book than in 3 months of study. So I start with that as part of this conversation because I'm not here to talk about you, I'm here to talk about us. This is what we do as human beings, isn't it? We all do this. We come into circumstances, we quickly evaluate what's going on, and then we determine something about those people. And usually, we don't even have the time to follow up and find out whether that determination is true. We just simply start interacting from there. And I know we've got a very short time for this talk, and this is a topic that we could easily take 45 days to talk about rather than 45 minutes. But I also am really aware, and I want to acknowledge that the folks at Google have done some of the most forward-thinking work on this that I know of companies doing. So I know some of this is stuff that you may have heard in one form or another, but my own experience has been that you can't hear it enough to continue to have us be focused on this. So I want to just start by sharing just a handful of very quick studies of what we're learning about how this shows up. For example, we know because research at University of Pennsylvania and Cornell has found that basketball referees tend to give fouls to players of the opposite race more than players of their same race. And this is true for both white referees and for African American referees. It's different degrees, but nonetheless still the same. We know that people make determinations of people's credibility based on accent. There are researchers at Tel Aviv University and at the University of Chicago found that we tend to believe people more if they have an accent that's more similar to us and less if they have an accent that's more different, with one exception. Anybody want to guess what it is? British. Yeah, we tend to think people with British accents are smarter. They not only make great villains, they are also smarter. One of my clients in New York has a guy who grew up in Liverpool, which of course they speak Cockney there. He called it gutter English. And he said when he goes home to visit his family and then comes back to New York, he says, "I feel myself getting smarter every mile I fly." We also know that hand dominance is a factor. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in the Netherlands have found that we tend to make decisions based on hand dominance. In other words, if you're right-handed, you may be more likely to hire somebody who's sitting on your right side than who happens to interview on your left side. Makes no sense at all. Just tends to happen. And this is a study I did. I've got an artificial knee, and whenever I go through the TSA process, I have to be screened. So I began to notice that when I was dressed in business clothing, I seemed to be going through faster than I was dressed more casually. Turns out about 47% faster. Now, I could go on because there are literally over 1,000 studies in the last 10 years alone of this. We know that this dynamic happens almost everywhere we are. So the question is, when we look at it relative to height, name, race, gender, hand dominance, religion, accent, almost every kind of human identity factor that you can imagine, the question is not, do we have bias? The question is really, which are ours? And that's hard for us to get as human beings because for the most part, we've seen bias as a fundamentally bad thing. For the most part, we've created this sort of bias equals badness paradigm. And that's challenging for us. The very notion that we have bias challenges us to be able to look at ourselves in ways that are very practical. So what I want to talk about is how that happens, why it happens, and what are some of the things that we're learning we can do about this both individually and collectively to create organizations, especially where we can make better decisions, not just so that we can be nice to each other or sing kumbaya, but so that we can actually make good organizational decisions and good talent management decisions. And it shows up in virtually everything we do. Now, we know that bias is a natural function of the human brain, and it happens for a very clear reason. What function does bias serve? Anybody? Why do we have bias?
It keeps us safe.
Yeah, it keeps us safe, exactly right. It's a human danger detector. We have to quickly determine whether this person is somebody we want to go towards or away from. It triggers fight, flight, or freeze in us. And bias is as natural to human beings as breathing. The challenge is when we demonize it, when we start to recognize bias as something that if we have, we're bad people, it actually puts us into hiding more. It causes us to not look at our bias as much, but actually deflect from, find reasons for our belief systems. Now, this is challenging as somebody who's worked in the diversity space for about 30 years. This is really challenging because for so long, the diversity space has lived inside of this sort of good person, bad person paradigm, if you will. And, we're sort of looking for the bad one and trying to fix them. And this is what a lot of diversity training has been, is find them and fix them training. Which is why a lot of times people come into diversity training like this. And even the discourse that we have reinforces that in lots of ways. That we advocate rather than trying to build something together. It's inherently problematic. And then we build biases into our institutions as well. So what do we call bias, for example, when you agree to write them down, when we all agree to them and even write them down?
Qualifications.
Yeah, qualifications. That's all qualifications are. Qualifications are simply biases that we've all agreed to and written down. Now, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. They can be very helpful sometimes. If you're evaluating hundreds and hundreds of resumes, it's valuable to have qualifications so that you can sort those resumes quickly. But it's not necessarily particularly helpful in terms of choosing the best person, and it intentionally and problematically can sometimes exclude people who are, we might call the creative eccentrics. The people who are outside of the norm of what we do. So we're going to look at basically how this works and how it plays itself out. Now we know that all human beings have built within us through our life experience, we might call an internal book of rules. It happens all the time. We pick up throughout our life certain ways that we're supposed to be. And it's consistent with the things that we've been taught throughout our whole life. Various different kinds of things that we've learned are the right way to be or the wrong way to be. So for example, how'd you know to do that, Will?
You extended your hand.
Right, and in our culture, that's what we do. And how did that handshake feel?
Not so strong.
Not so strong, right. See, I didn't shake Will's hand in the way that we usually do in our culture, which is kind of like a wrestling match. They wanted to meet you, a little bit softer. But for the most part, when that happens, how many people here have heard somebody say, if somebody shakes hands with that, like you at the beginning of an interview, forget it, it's over. This is sort of, now how crazy is that? Think about it. It's kind of insane, isn't it? that we would take one thing like that. I could have a disability, I could have an injury to my hand, I could come from one of the 1/3 of the cultures on the planet where shaking hands softer is the norm, but that's the kind of reaction we have. By the way, your reaction, Will, was pretty calm compared to some I've had. I did that with the leadership team of a major governmental institution, and the guy who I shook hands with was this kind of football linebacker guy. He practically fell off his chair, reacting to the handshake. So we have literally thousands of rules in our internal rule book. They're unquestioned for the most part. They're not rules that we even see as rules. We just see them as the way things are. And that rule structure creates in our mind what we call schema. Schema are frameworks for looking at the world that I know you work with in different ways that shape the things we see and the things that we don't. So for example, look at this picture for a moment. And tell me if you can see any discernible image in this picture. What do you see?
A bunny rabbit.
A bunny rabbit. Okay, anybody else?
I assumed it was an aerial shot.
An aerial shot. Okay, anybody else? A Google map? Huh?
I kind of see a bird.
A bird. Let me make it easier for you. I'm going to superimpose a picture over now so you can see the actual image. Now what do you see? Cow. Does everybody see the cow? Anybody who doesn't see it yet? We could always do a remedial session, but let me point it out to you. So here are the two ears, the two eyes and the nose, and this is the forehead. Okay, everybody sees the cow now. Now I'm going to remove the superimposed picture. And tell me now if you can avoid seeing the cow. Right? Something that wasn't there a minute ago, invisible a minute ago, is now impenetrably in our line of vision. This is the way schema works. In this case, I've actually consciously shifted the schema to one in which you can now see something that wasn't there before. Now, we all know this happens. We know that it happens from the standpoint of our jobs. Everybody here has certain schema in your job that have you see things that other people don't see. There are people who shine shoes, for example, who when somebody walks by are not looking at the people, they're looking at the shoes. You or I would see the people walking by, they would see the shoes. This is the nature of the way schema works. It shapes what we see and what we don't. And if this can be true for something as silly as a picture or as seemingly superficial to us as a particular job that we happen to be in at the moment, how can it not be true for us based on these identities we live our whole lives in? Our gender, our race, our sexual orientation, our age, the generation we come from. All of these things are fundamentally affecting the schema, affecting the things that we see and the things that we don't. And this is why sometimes we're in circumstances where one person or a group of people see certain things that other people just don't notice. So schema leads to the formation of background. I mean background in the sense that I shape the world by my experience, that I actually see the world through a filter that is governed by the background experience that I've had. It's like a lens through which we filter the world. And background creates a phenomenon of a coloration of our world, if you will. It's like a contact lens that gets put on over our eyes before we even realize that it's there. And the world actually looks blue to us, or green to us, or orange to us, depending upon what that lens is. And we sit there and talk to each other through different lenses and often accuse each other of not seeing things, but the reality is we can't see them, or we're not oriented towards seeing them unless we stop and notice that we have this lens on. Now, if somebody stops and says, oh, you have a blue lens on, all of a sudden I look at that white wall colored blue in a different way. It still looks blue to me, but my awareness that it's blue is different. So our work in trying to understand this relative to bias is, can we understand how our life experiences have filtered the people and the things we're doing in a way that when we see that difference, it actually gives us the opportunity to make that mental switch to understand what we're putting into the conversation and others aren't. John Searle, a brilliant philosopher from the University of California, says background enables linguistic interpretation to take place, enables perceptual interpretation to take place, and it actually structures our consciousness. It actually gives us the world that we see in a profound way. And so we're not talking about something that happens to some people, and we're not talking to something that happens to bad people. We're talking about something that happens to people, that this is the fundamental way the human mind works. And it impacts us. And on an everyday basis, because background creates context, and context is everything in terms of how we see the world. And we know context shifts things quite dramatically and in funny ways. For example, if it's in the middle of the winter in Washington, D.C., where I live, 60 degrees means take off your shirt and lay out and get some sun. If it's the middle of the summer when it's 100 degrees, 60 degrees means let's get a sweatshirt. It's cold. So context is constantly shifting the way we see things. So let me switch for a moment. This is my granddaughter, Sloan. She has nothing to do with the presentation. I just love showing pictures of my grandchildren. So, no. But all kidding aside, my second oldest son and his family moved to Washington, where we live, and a couple of years ago, and they lived with us for a few months while they were waiting for their house to be ready. And Sloan came in one night just before dinner, and she asked for a cookie, and I said to her, of course, wasn't a good time to have a cookie just before dinner. She made me promise that I would tell you she's 9 now. And being 5 at the time, she still wanted a cookie, so I put her in my lap, and in my wisest grandfatherly voice, explained to her that it wasn't a good idea. Explained to her all the reasons why, little bit of, in 5-year-old terms, the physiology of why it wasn't good for your tummy and all this stuff. And she listened very thoughtfully and asked questions and the like. And then I finished and I said, do you understand, sweetie? And she said, yeah. Now can I have a cookie? Everybody here knows what I'm talking about, right? We wake up in the morning. Today I'm going to eat better. And by lunch, seemingly by itself, our hand is going like this with something we're not supposed to be eating. There's something about a dissonance between what we know we should be doing and what we actually do. What we know we should be thinking and what we actually think. What we know we should be feeling and what we actually feel. And we're understanding this more and more in the mind. So I'm going to talk about 5 basic functions and patterns of the mind that impact these things relative to bias. One is selective attention or inattentional blindness, projection, power and empathy. And this is stuff I'm really excited about because some of the newest research we're doing is around power and empathy. Social primacy, and finally, the subliminal, because we know that a lot of stuff is affected subliminally. Now let's start with this guy. 2,500 years ago to Plato, because how Western thought is oriented relative to emotion and reason comes from Plato. I mean, there are probably lots of other people who were thinking that, but Plato was certainly the one who we remember. Plato, as some of you know, who remember from Philosophy 101, in his Dialogues of Phaedrus, talked about how reason was like the charioteer who held the raging emotions of the horses in place. And we've built a culture, particularly in Western culture, that worships at the altar of the rational. If you think about it, it's like, you sure you're being rational about that? You sure you're not being too emotional? You know, it's really built into our way of thinking that one is better than the other. It's kind of normal for us to think that way. The only problem is, it's counter to what we're learning about the brain. In fact, over 30 years of studying emotional intelligence, and I'm not talking about studying it at Esalen, I'm talking about some of the major universities in the world, we've learned that virtually all of the things we do, whether making decisions, strategy, behavior, or performance, relationships, all of these things are fundamentally governed by emotion. In fact, that human beings are far less rational than we are rationalizing. In other words, we have an emotional or visceral reaction to something, and we quickly gather the data to support that feeling. So if I meet somebody and I have this moment where I say, you know, there's something about that person I like. Now, even that thought that we have after 5 seconds of meeting somebody is folly if you give it any thought at all. I mean, how could it possibly be about them? I've only known them for 5 seconds. So obviously I'm projecting something onto them. They probably remind me of somebody from my past. But nonetheless, that's our response, and then we act accordingly. And this shows up in interviews. So let's say Anna comes in the morning and I meet you, and I have that feeling, something about you that I like. So I ask you the first question of the interview, and you hem and haw a little bit. Without even thinking about it, I say, look, I know it's an interview. Take a breath. Let me ask the question again. You get a second chance. Now the interview goes great. I'm making eye contact. I'm laughing at your jokes, whatever. Will comes in the afternoon. Let's say it's not even one of those times when my sleaze alarm goes off, although that sometimes happens. Not with you, of course, but it sometimes happens. You meet somebody and they turn you off. But let's say it's more that you, I'm distracted. I just got off a meeting with a client and, it's still in my mind. So I'm only half with you, and I ask you the first question of the interview, and this time, as you hem and haw, I just sit there. Or even worse, I make one of those quick glances at my watch that you're not supposed to see. Now you're sweating bullets. And based on nothing more than that, the interview goes 2 completely different directions. Elizabeth asked me the next day, how did it go? And I say, bright, easy to talk to. I think she'd work out fine here. He's okay. I have no idea, no conscious idea that I had anything to do with those interviews. Now, is there anybody here who doesn't know that you do this to people 25 times a day? Or you pass one person in the hallway, you say hello, somebody else you don't. Subtleties, things that are influencing us. You interview one person in the morning when you're fresh at your desk. You interview a second person, even using a structured interviewing process. You interview a second person over lunch, and you interview a third person at the end of the day when you're tired, and you've actually conducted 3 different interviews, even though the structured questions are the same questions. So we're influenced by things that we don't even realize. Now we know, and people like Danny Kahneman and other people have taken us way ahead of this. I know that you've studied this work, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. But we know that a lot of this happens in the fast brain, in the limbic system. We see some circumstance or some person. It catalyzes a particular reaction as we filter through the background what we see. The faster the emotional brain takes over, the amygdala sends a signal to the hippocampus and says, what is this? And then to the hypothalamus, the sort of air traffic controller of the brain, which sends the signal to someplace else, and then maybe to the anterior cingulate cortex or the cingulate gyrus and says, get that foot or leg in action. If I were to take this clicker and throw it to somebody, your hand would come up to catch it before you even had a thought. And this is all very important. Very fast brain is very helpful to us. It's where stereotyping happens. We see that person, we make that assessment. Smile, friendly, fist, dangerous. Knife above the head, watch out. We know somebody comes up with a knife above our head, we don't look up and say, oh, what is that? And I wonder what it is and what he's going to do with it. It's not a very practical way to operate. And similarly, when we see certain behaviors, we associate with that. Now, tremendously helpful, tremendously valuable, and tremendously necessary for our survival. Also tremendously problematic in terms of making assumptions about people at times. And this is the challenge that we have, that's coming up. In those circumstances, do we really know what we're seeing, or are we reacting to what we're seeing? And we know times when the mind and our eyes can even be deceiving. So for example, if you look at this checkerboard, this is Ted Adelson, who's at the MIT, and you look at block A and block B up here, which one is darker? Now, A clearly looks darker. I know some of you are saying, what's the trick? But A clearly looks darker, right? In actuality, they're exactly the same color. Now, the reason it looks darker is because the eyes align around a particular expectation. The cones and rods of the eyes actually align around, and we have an expectation. Pattern recognition is one of the most familiar functions of the human mind, and most of us are very familiar with the light, dark pattern of a checkerboard. It's actually the same color because the shadowing area created by the pillar darkens B and makes it the same color. This is not a computer trick, by the way. You could test it out yourself. Dr. Adelson has this available online, so you can look at it. So we're making this assumption that they're different when actually they're the same. Now, the fascinating thing about this one to me is even though we now know they're the same, they still look different. Isn't that extraordinary? You would think that if our rational mind was actually leading the way, that now that we know they're the same, that we would see them as the same. But it's an indication of how we're rooted into these very kinds of things that trigger us in ways that we don't know. And the same thing can happen with people. Even though I know that person, I should treat that person the same as I treat somebody else, my visceral feeling about that person can still in very subtle ways. So I know you've been dealing with micro behaviors, micro advantages, micro inequities that play out through the various ways this happens. Who do I invite to lunch? Who do I pay more attention to? We know, for example, from the research we're doing with power, that people in power situations tend to make less eye contact when they're listening and more eye contact when they're speaking. This shows up a lot in male-female relationships particularly, that men have a tendency, because societally, it's not a personal power, but societally it plays itself out, that men will pay more attention, give more eye contact when we're speaking and less eye contact when we're listening to women. And I'm talking now archetypically, of course, not about every man and every woman. So these are subtleties that can play out in ways. And then, of course, we then associate certain things. So projection becomes another piece of this. Projection is simply the dynamic that has us look out there in the world and determine what that is based on a prior experience or prior knowledge of what that thing is we're looking at. To some degree, we project in every circumstance with everything we're doing. If I look at that form in front of me, I know it's a man because in my mind I say, oh, that's what men look like. Otherwise, everything that we see would be newly experienced. And we know this occurs in the brain, in the hippocampus, and how it might show up, for example, when diversity is concerned. I'll use an example. I grew up in the Leave It to Beaver generation. I know a lot of you are probably don't know what Leave It to Beaver was, but it was one of those sitcoms of the 60s and 70s. They were all the same. Dad went off to work in the morning with his briefcase and his suit on. Mom stayed home and did all the domestic chores in her pearls and high heels. I thought that was bizarre even when I was a kid. Nonetheless, the kids would do something mischievous and Dad would come home and solve the family's problems. This was the sitcom MO of the 1960s and early 70s. All virtually the same. So if one grew up in that generation, then probably on an unconscious level, you have some association between the role of women and domestic responsibility. Now, you're sitting in a meeting and the vice president of production, Jane Smith, walks in, and without even thinking about it, you turn to Jane and say, Jane, can you go check and see if we have any coffee? Because at that moment, Jane Smith becomes June Cleaver. Now, another dynamic of this, which is really important, is to recognize that Jane may also herself say, let me go see if there's any coffee, because she may also have internalized the responsibility of being June Cleaver. And this is really important for us to get, that we internalize these same dynamics about ourselves, expectations about ourselves, as other people have about us. We're constantly projecting on each other. It's one of the most foundational pieces of the way we look at each other as human beings. And so that's all happening on a fast brain level, and now we know we also have this capacity for slow brain thinking. The prefrontal cortex, of course, this remarkable part of the human brain, which allows us to have thoughts like, what made me think about that? You know, any of us who've had dogs and put them out in the backyard know when they see the squirrel, doesn't seem like they say, should I chase that squirrel? You know, human beings do have that capacity. Now, we don't always use that capacity, of course, but we do have the capacity to have those thoughts. And this remarkable capacity of the human brain to have this kind of thinking, it makes us extraordinary. However, when we know that when something triggers us, triggers that limbic fast brain reaction, that part of the brain tends to lose its power. In fact, we can look at brain scans and see the blood actually flows back to the limbic system and leaves the prefrontal cortex. Daniel Goleman called this an amygdala hijacking. The amygdala takes over the system, and this is where our kind of fear reactions come from. And amygdala hijacking puts us back into fight, flight, or freeze, sort of more basic instinctive reactions. Freud said that the conscious, or the more thoughtful part of our brain, was the iceberg, and the unconscious, the largest part underneath, but current research shows that the conscious is more like a snowball on the tip of the iceberg. That virtually everything we do is governed by unconscious. In fact, the fast brain probably operates a couple 100,000 times more than the slow brain does. So we're constantly making these determinations, which we're then rationalizing. The net of all this is that, as Bucky Fuller said, 99% of who you are is invisible and untouchable. Or as my friend Sukhvinder Obi, who's a brain scientist in Canada, says, our brains seem to have evolved to be good enough most of the time. Now, this is a bit threatening to smart people. This is why here at Google you have to be particularly careful about this. Because when we've been rewarded our whole life for being smart, we begin to believe and have confidence that our opinion, what we see, makes more sense than it actually does. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. So this creates diagnosis bias, the tendency to spot things and determine it really quickly. Diagnosis bias, we might say, is the propensity to label people, ideas, or things based on our initial opinions. So I want you to imagine, for example, that you've got a grown son, and your son says, I'm going to bring my love interest home, my new love interest home, and or son or daughter will say, and they say, we're going to bring our new love interest home. And these are the two people whose pictures you see about possibly being the love interest. You know, who would you be more inclined to hope it is? You know. Well, this on the left is John Fetterman. He's the mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania. That's his zip code on his arm. He's master's degree in public policy from Harvard, served in AmeriCorps, and has done amazing things about transforming his community financially. He goes around the country now apparently training other communities to do this. This is Ted Bundy, the serial killer. We make these determinations having nothing to do with rationality. This is just who we are and what we do. And this leads to particular reaction. Those reactions come from a couple different places. Amy Cuddy and Susan Fisk and Peter Glick have identified this in two ways. One is how warmly, how likable that person is, and the other is how competent we hold them. And this can show up in lots of ways. We can feel very warmly towards somebody and not respect them and their competence. This happens, of course, sometimes with people who are elderly people or people with disabilities, that sort of thing. Also, with certain other groups who we like them, it's just we don't even realize, because we like them so much, how much we're diminishing them. This is where sort of patronizing liberalism can come from also. Or we see them as competent, we just don't like them so much. This is a lot what LGBT folks face. It's not that people don't think that they're competent, it's just that they may be competent, but I'm just not comfortable with them, somebody might say. So it's important for us to be able to distinguish that, because it gives us a better handle on how this might play out in different places. Another of these phenomena is selective attention. Now, selective attention is one that we all know. In fact, Sukhvinder and I were talking recently. He said, I noticed when I found out my wife was pregnant, all of a sudden the next day I was out and I began to notice baby strollers in a different way. I began to go up to people and say, tell me how come that baby stroller has this versus that. He said, my whole life I've never had any interest in baby strollers, but one thing happens and boom, all of a sudden I see the world in a different way. We know that we see that. Now, we've had some really fascinating research about this. One of them, we're doing some work with the American Association of Medical Colleges, training people in medical schools to be more sensitive to how unconscious bias plays out in things like health disparities. And this study came from there. This guy, Trafton Drew at Harvard Medical School, sent out to radiologists a lung scan, asked them to check for cancer nodes, which are tiny, tiny microscopic things. But there's something interesting about this lung scan. Do you see it up here? Yeah, this grill is a little highlighted, so you can see it a little bit more than it was in the original picture. You want to get really scared? 83% of the radiologists didn't see it. Cancer nodes are about 1/50 at that size. They were looking for this. They didn't see this. It's remarkable how this happens, and it happens in lots of other ways. Now, one particular case, a legal case that this happened in, Kenneth Conley was a police officer who was convicted in 1997 of perjury because he was chasing a perpetrator of a crime, ran right past somebody who was being beaten up and denied seeing them, and the court didn't believe him, basically. He was convicted of the crime. Now, he was eventually exonerated. Well, two researchers, Daniel Simons and Chris Chabris, who some of you are familiar with because of their gorilla, the invisible gorilla exercise that they're very well known for. And they've been really brilliantly out front of this whole inattentional blindness conversation. Recreated the experiment. They had students run around a campus. This one student was following another student as they were running, and the student in front was told to touch his cap routinely. And the student behind was told to count the number of times they touched the cap. While this was happening, they actually ran past a simulated fight. And then they checked how many people actually saw that fight. They found only 1/3 people noticed the fight at night, which was the conditions the actual crime occurred, and 40% didn't. Only 40% noticed it in broad daylight. In other words, when we're attentive to one thing, we always miss other things. We can't see everything, so we see the things we're focused on. This is why so often when we're in meetings, one person will see something, and somebody else will say, "Well, I didn't see that," and we have a tendency because of that good person, bad person paradigm where diversity is concerned to assume that that means that people didn't care about it, when in fact they just may not have seen it. So this is the nature of how it plays out. Now, we also know we're influenced subliminally. So, for example, University of Leicester researchers recently went into a wine shop, actually a grocery store, the wine department, cleared it out, put only French and German wine on. On alternative days, they played French music, German music, or put a French flag and German flag up. And then they tracked buying patterns. On days that the French flag was up, 77% bought French wine. On days when German flag was up, 73% bought German wines. Whoops. Only 14% said they even heard the music, and only one person in the entire study said that they actually thought it influenced them. Another one from medical schools at University Toronto Medical School. They tracked the results of medical school interviews against the weather reports from the day that people were interviewed. Put them in parallel, found that the people who were interviewed on rainy days received scores on the interviews roughly equivalent to as if they'd had 10% lower scores in their MCATs. Nobody thinks a medical school interviewer says, "It's raining, I'm going to cut 10 points off." But nonetheless, so these things are influencing us all the time. The question is, of course, what's influencing us today? What's impacting us today? And then, as I said before, a lot of the new research we're doing is around power and empathy because we're learning some fascinating things. Sure that many of you know about the findings of mirror neurons, that back in the late 90s in Parma, Italy, in a lab, they determined mirror neurons in macaque monkeys. They realized that these monkeys tended to have the same brain experience when they watched a researcher eating peanuts as when they were eating peanuts themselves. Remarkable. Marco Iacoboni at UCLA later identified this in human beings as well. So we have this remarkable capacity to mirror people who are around us and to sense what's going on around us. It creates a phenomenon we call homophily, the tendency to love the same, to love people who are like us. But we also know that we have a tendency for in-group, out-group bias, and we've known this for over 100 years. William Graham Sumner, the first director of the Department of Sociology at Yale University, determined this way back in 1906. And we're constantly pulled between this tendency to want to resonate with people and this in-group, out-group bias. And it shows up in non-dominant and dominant groups. So people in dominant groups will tend to have less mirroring than people who are in non-dominant groups. Those in power will tend to mirror less than those who are out of power. And that's true both individually, when we're power holders in organizations, that is managers versus non-management, for example. And it's also true when we're in powered groups. So the dominant groups in society, for example, in American society, white, male, Christian, heterosexual, that will have a tendency to mirror less, to sense what's going on with people less. We also know that where empathy is concerned, that what the research shows is, and this is research from China, from the US, from Italy, from all over the world, that shows us that we tend to have less empathy as soon as we spot people who are different from us, and the first classification for that is race. That we'll tend to have less empathy. Now, let's put this in the context of traditional diversity training. A lot of the training that we've done, that we did over the years, and I go back, way back to the time, the early diversity training where we used to do it with a 2x4, a lot of it was advocacy work. We're letting people to understand what it's like to be a member of this group or that group. Ironically, what the brain science is now teaching us is that may make us less empathetic for the people we're dealing with. It doesn't mean that you can't control people that way. You can get people to be careful about what they say, but to get people fully engaged, it may be actually counterindicated to what we're trying to accomplish. Maybe well-intentioned, counterindicated to what we're trying to accomplish. And Sukhvinder, in his, is because as soon as I identify you as somebody different from me, my empathy center begins to slow down. I can now be careful around you, be careful not to upset you, but I'm less likely to resonate with you. I'm less likely to actually be fully engaged with you. And so it may be good for controlling diversity, but maybe not so good for creating inclusion in that regard. It's ironic, because at some level it was what we needed to do in the early days, because it's like the sculptor with the big block of stone. You take the big chisel to start to do the work. But from the standpoint of organizations who really want to create full inclusion, and we were just talking about this relative, for example, to when you're working, for example, in gender dynamics. If you only work with women in gender dynamics, you likely are not going to get the same kind of inclusion as if you work with men and women around gender dynamics, as an example. Sukhvinder in his research found that it turned out that when people were in a powerless mindset, their mirroring system was increased. They became more sensitive to external stimulus, whereas people were feeling powerful, the mirror neuron activation was lower. Power, it turns out, decreases empathy. Is there anything we can do about this? And on an individual level, I want to talk about this on an individual level real quickly. And then I also want to talk with you about systemically what are some things that we're learning we can do about this, because we're now working with companies all over the world to try to have them develop cultures that are more inclusive, understanding these issues. So the first is to understand that the unconscious is remarkably malleable. That we've got this remarkable capacity for neuroplasticity. The notion that you can't teach an old dog new tricks isn't even true for dogs. We're constantly learning new things. The first, and by far the most important thing of these 6 ways that we're finding for individuals to work, is to recognize and accept that you have bias. To remove guilt from the equation and start taking responsibility. Now this is hard because a lot of the diversity conversation has lived in guilt. And that's challenging. This notion, if I have bias, oh my God, I'm a bad person. I thought I was a better person, but I'm a bad person. But in actuality, if we can't choose that, if 90+% of the things that happen every day in organizations that differentially impact one person versus another occur more like what I talked about in this interview than they do because somebody's out to get somebody, it's challenging for us to accept that in ourselves and work with it. The metaphor I like to use is it's kind of like the clutch in a standard transmission automobile. When the standard transmission automobile, you step on the clutch, the engine doesn't stop running, it just stops motoring the car. So this is where mindfulness work can really come in. Learning self-observation work can really come in to help us. We can begin to notice the bias in ourselves, but by noticing it with non-judgmental awareness, we can say, okay, I have that bias. I need to watch how that impacts my interaction with this person. But that is fundamentally built on the notion that we can create environments in which we can talk about those biases. And we know that we live in a cultural environment where that's not welcomed right now. It's dangerous. It has legal implications, particularly. So that can be really problematic. And that's why the second is most important, to develop the capacity to, well, we call it using a flashlight on ourselves. My friend Michael Schieser kind of coined that term, to watch ourselves in action. Are there certain people who trigger us more? Are there certain circumstances in which we feel a little antsy? Are there certain ways of being that cause us to make quick reactions more easily? And by the way, this piece is really important, especially for Googlers, because you've got so many smart people here. How much does intelligence, confidence, and success matter to this? Well, actually, what the research now shows is that people who are intelligent, successful, and highly confident are more likely rather than less likely to have blind spots. The more you feel like you've got this handled, the more dangerous it becomes. It requires an enormous sense of humility. And I say this all the time to my colleagues in the diversity space, that we have to be careful that we don't come in like our stuff don't smell. Like we don't have this issue. Because even the fact that, the reason I started with the story about myself and the angry Santa Claus was because even though I've been doing this for 30 years, I'm still just as susceptible to bias as anybody else is. Now, hopefully we can get to the place where we can notice it more and embrace it more. But as you take this work out, you're going to have to be careful that all the great work you've done doesn't reaffirm, okay, now that we've got this handled, we don't have to keep looking at it. And this is particularly challenging in environments like yours. It requires us practicing constructive uncertainty, to really take a pause. Rollo May, the great psychologist, said freedom is the capacity to pause between stimulus and response. So we've created this little mnemonic. The P is to pay attention to what's actually happening beneath our judgments and assessments. And then the second is to acknowledge your own reactions, interpretations, and judgments. The third is to understand other potential reactions that there might be there. And then to select the one that's the most empowering in the environment, and finally to execute that. So I go back to Will and my handshake. He shakes my hand and it's softer. He says, okay, I notice his handshake is softer. I notice that I have a tendency, let's say, to interpret that as weakness. I got to be careful about that. He could have an injury. At that moment, he's now thinking from here rather than from over there. That's a moment of freedom. That's when we have the moment to make a determination potentially about what's going on with that person. To explore awkwardness and discomfort. Those times when something's off, rather than to back away from it and search to comfort, I mean, what's triggering me here? What's making me uncomfortable? The fifth is to engage with people you consider to be others and expose yourself to exemplars. Now, this is really interesting. Brian Nozick and Calvin Lay at the University of Virginia just last year issued a paper where they studied a whole host of attempts that people had to soften the impact of bias and found that this was by far the most valuable one. The things you have on the wall, the images that you see, the various kinds of things that reinforce what's good, what's not good. This is why things like Black History Month are so valuable still. Even though it would be a lot more valuable if the 11 months weren't White History Month and if we didn't choose the shortest month of the year to be Black History Month, which has always been kind of interesting. But those kinds of things do reinforce a softening or shifting of those biases. And then finally, giving and getting feedback. And I know that you're working a lot on that in your culture right now, that being able to give feedback. But it's important that that feedback be given in a compassionate way. And that is with an understanding that that person's behavior may not have been intentional. Because if that feedback, especially where diversity issues are concerned, because if that feedback reinforces the finger-pointing aspect of it, then it just drives it back underground again. People begin to go in hiding rather than simply engaging in that behavior. And the last piece, as we look at the group, is understanding social primacy. I mean, we're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, I'm sure. Abraham Maslow 70 years ago said you had to get basic needs met before you get other needs met. He said physiological needs met first and then safety and onward. Brilliant model, tremendously helpful to science. It appears that he may have been wrong, that in fact, our need for belongingness may be our key human need. And it makes sense if you think about it, a newborn baby can't get their physiological needs met unless they belong to somebody. The first imprint that we have as human beings is, I only exist because he or she exists. And this is core to us, this sense. And in fact, what science is now showing is that being excluded from group triggers activity in the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain, which is why every time one of these horrible instances happen, whether it's Columbine or Sandy Hook or this terrible thing that happened in Southern California a couple months ago, what's the first word you almost always hear to describe the perpetrator? Loner. Exactly. It also probably contributes to the fact that 4 times as many gay teenagers commit suicide because it gets internalized. And so we have to recognize that how we operate as a group has a huge impact on us. And this is why what you're taking on, training the entire organization, can have a huge impact. We have to change systems so that we're thinking from a systems perspective. Now, Just to give you an example of that, a lot of you know that in 1970, 5% of the musicians in the major orchestras in the world were women, and even after 1980, after 10 years of the women's movement, it was still only 12%, but now it's getting close to 40%. And why is that? Because orchestras around the world put in a whole host of activities designed to change the way they did that. They opened up auditions to people. They changed the way auditions were calibrated in terms of the numbers of people who were on the listening team. And they also did something structurally, which is to have musicians begin to audition behind screens and on rugs so that people could only evaluate the music rather than the musician. Well, you can begin to do things like that. On the other hand, we have to be careful to understand, to track things over time. How many people here have heard of the Scared Straight program? Anybody? Scared Straight was initiated in the late 1970s in Rahway, New Jersey, in a prison. They started bringing in young, what they called in those days, juvenile delinquents. We now call them youth offenders. Bring them in with tough prisoners, and the tough prisoners would scare the hell out of them and tell them, we'll do this to you and that to you if you come into prison. And they'd leave, and you could see them on film. 60 Minutes did a piece on it. See them and say, I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to come out. So great. Everybody started copying it. Orange is the New Black even had an episode about it. Right? 25 years later, they evaluated these programs. You know what they found? 13% more likely to go to jail. Now, my hypothesis about this, because I've worked with a lot of young people like that, is that most of them feel powerless, and their bravado is on top of that feeling of powerlessness. You put somebody who feels powerless into somebody who's the toughest SOB they've ever seen before, their internal mechanism says, if I act like that, then I'll be safe. So we have to be really careful as we put these things in place. So what we're starting to look at is 3 basic ways of doing organizational change around this. The first is priming. What kinds of things do you have people look at before they come into a circumstance? So for example, before people look at resumes, to take a few minutes and say, I want you to ask, answer these 8 questions. Does this resume remind you of anybody? Is that a positive or a negative memory? Is there something about this resume that jumps out at you particularly strongly? Is that really relevant to the job? Does this person remind you of yourself in any way? Is that relevant to the job? So questions that begin to orient. Now, there's 2 things. First of all, it actually gets you to look at the resume in a particular way. But secondly, by the way, all of this follows some basic education work around this issue. But secondly, and more importantly, it reminds me, wait a second, I've got to pay more attention to the evaluator than I do to the resume. And just that recognition, that awareness is really important. So there are dozens of ways that we can look at priming, and I've started to work with our clients around priming so that they come into these questions in particular, into these various structures in particular ways. The second way is to look at systems and structures. So we just saw a good example of that. When you have people do their audition behind a screen, that's a different system or structure. Where interviewing is concerned, for example, do you use structured interviewing, but also conduct interviews in the same place or at the same time of day? Before you do the interviews, do you give people potentially the questions that they're going to be asked so that people who are introverted versus extroverted, or people who come from different cultures or for whom English is their second language, aren't at a disadvantage in terms of quickly responding to those questions? So we can look at all kinds of ways to do that. The third is, of course, accountability, and that is, what are we tracking? What are the numbers we're tracking? Kahneman said the odds of limiting the constraints of biases in a group setting rise when discussion of them is widespread. So that you're talking about it a lot actually will encourage people to take it more seriously. Now, if that becomes in the background, that's the problem. The problem is, how do we keep talking about it in new and different ways? How do we keep keeping it fresh for people? Because at some point, it becomes like the wallpaper. At some point it becomes, you look at the mountains out here, these beautiful mountains, and most of you probably don't even notice them anymore if you've been coming here every day, because they become like the wallpaper in the background. And even though they were extraordinary and beautiful the first time you saw them, at some point they're just there. So we have to keep this conversation fresh. So we're looking at a whole range of things. We look in talent management. How do we recruit, outsource, interview, hire, onboard, mentor and sponsor, performance review, calibration, recognizing talent, developing, promoting that talent? What are the things that contribute to all of those kinds of things? We're looking at the various ways that people operate internally, interpersonal interactions, collaboration, leadership, team functionality, creativity, and innovation. How does it contribute to all those kinds of things? And finally, to the external relationship we have. And in each of these areas, you can begin to put in place little tweaks. One of my colleagues in Europe calls them inclusion nudges. A little nudge that has people look in this direction or that direction, so that we can begin to say, okay, let's stop and look at this process. Now, in order to do that, we've got to slow down. We've got to build pauses into our processes. We've got to be able to ask, is this process actually doing what we think it's doing? Are there factors here that are influencing us that we don't know that are influencing us? And this is, of course, anathema sometimes to most American business cultures. You see, even if we do all of this, we're in danger. Even if we put all the right systems in place, we can be in danger of not being very effective. I've struggled with my weight my whole life up until the last few years. I've been 30 or 40 pounds heavier than I am now. And if you look at my weight chart for most of my life up until about 3 years ago when I became vegan, it's been like this, you know. And during all that time when I was heavy, I knew everything there was to know about dieting. I promise you, I read every diet book there was. I tried every fad diet there was. I mean, not like it's that hard anyway. You eat less and you exercise more, right? And I'm sure everybody here has something like that in your life, something you know you should be doing but you don't do. There's something beyond developing strategies, and that is developing new awarenesses for the way we think. This is what you have the capacity to do here in what you're trying to do with your unconscious bias process. And that is to really shift our way of thinking. It's scary to us as human beings, because if we really understand what this stuff is teaching us, it's that we can't trust the way we think. And that's a scary feeling for us as human beings. We want to go towards certainty. We want to go to thinking that we know what we're doing. So I'd like to end with this picture. This is a picture of an aspen forest in Colorado, because for me it's a perfect metaphor for who we are as human beings. I'm sure many of you have seen these aspen trees. They're remarkable. They're 80 to 100 feet tall, and there are thousands of them. They say ramrod straight on these beautiful mountainsides, you know. And there's something really remarkable about aspen trees, and that is they're not individual trees at all. The aspen forests are the largest intact organisms of the world. The largest one in northern Utah is 80,000 trees, one plant, connected by a common root system. For me, it's a perfect metaphor for who we are as human beings. You know, we look at these identities as if we're different. And we do have different content in our identities. We do have different experiences in our life and different ways our identities shape our world. But at an underneath level, at the root level, we basically relate to the world very similarly. And if we can remember that as we're dealing with each other and bring compassion to each other in that way, our opportunity to really understand how we see the world becomes very real for us. And the ability to work together, create organizations where everybody can be effective becomes possible. Thanks.
So I was just wondering, did you stay in touch with Dr. Santa?
No, unfortunately, I was so stunned that I didn't even think to do, you know, I was just sort of, in fact, instantly what I did is I started judging myself. You know, I can't believe you did this after 25 or 30 years of doing diversity work, you're still doing this. And then by that time, he was gone. But it was one of those sort of moments, if you will. You know,
so you had a slide up there about how different races affect empathy.
Yes.
Have there ever been studies done on does the type of, like, the differences in races, like different types of races, how that affects the amount of empathy? Or is it just
how
the fact that it's...
the what of empathy? I'm sorry?
How much, like, the differences in empathy, like how much you empathize with someone else? Is there any studies on the different types
Oh, you
of
mean,
races?
in other words, does one race trigger
Yeah.
empathy less than others?
Exactly.
I don't know of that, but my suspicion would be based on my experience of working with this in other areas, is that it probably relates more to your own background and how those racial dynamics showed up in your particular community, or, you know, the structure around you when you grew up. So if you grow up in an environment, let's say in the United States, where the race conversation has most dramatically been defined between black and white, it probably is stronger there, which is one of the reasons why Latinos and Asians and Native Americans, for example, often feel left out of that conversation, because we tend to look at the extremes. But we do know that race is the first thing that the human mind responds to when we look at each other, which really makes sense if you think about it, because, you know, gender, for example, everybody has had some intimate, or almost everybody has had some intimate relationship with somebody of the opposite gender, but many of us do not necessarily have any kind of intimate relationship with somebody of the opposite race. So it's the first identifier that we see, and therefore the first protective reaction we tend to come up with. The other thing is that of course, because of internalized bias, we used to call it internalized oppression, it's now often become called stereotype threat. We internalize the messages about people like us. For example, when they do the implicit association test, they find that if you do the implicit association test between whites and blacks, that something like 75% of whites will more positively associate with whites than blacks, but a majority of blacks will also associate with whites more than blacks because they've internalized the same negative stereotypes about people like them. So the key here is to recognize that even when we're good people and we think we're being fair, we may have a tendency to have less identification. And if we put this in the context of the Fisk and Cuddy work around warmth and competence, the way that can show up is I may have warmth for you, but my empathetic response may not be in being sensitive to the competence you bring to the conversation. And this is hard for us, those of us who are progressives and see ourselves as really progressive on this issue. I tell you, my experience has been that working with organizations that see themselves as progressive is sometimes more challenging rather than less challenging around these issues. Because we identify as seeing ourselves as the good people. You know, the ones who have this handled and are less likely to be able to look at things in ourselves. Whereas when we go into really conservative organizations, they say, I don't know anything about this, teach me what to do. They are very clear that they haven't paid any attention to this. And so that's why organizations that are progressive thinking organizations like Google have to especially keep your nose to the grindstone, so to speak, in terms of continuing to develop that mindfulness around this subject, because our success, our competence, can blind us to the places we still have work to do. And this is not it's not a place we get to. It's like exercise. You know, you never get there. If you build it into your life on a regular basis, you know that it will maintain your health. But if you think you're just going to exercise until you get yourself into shape and then stop, you know how that works out. You know, it seems like at my age, 2 minutes later, I'm out of shape. So,
One of the largest concerns with diversity training is the potential for backlash, especially among individuals who feel like they are not benefiting from the training.
Yes.
So given this concern, what are some recommendations that you would recommend when giving diversity trainings to ensure that it is something that is inclusive for all employees?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it goes back to the point I made before about sort of the traditional diversity training, which has largely been aimed at people, certain groups of people, particularly people who look like this, frankly. You know, that diversity training is to teach white guys to be, you know, more inclusive, more whatever. You know, I'm Jewish, and I know, you know, Jewish people who rail against anti-Semitism and make a questionable racial comment. I know African Americans who rail against racism and then make a homophobic or heterosexist comment. I know, you know, LGBT folks who rail against that and then make a questionable comment about immigrants. We've all got something going on with somebody. And I think one of the things we need to do is to speak to the universality of that. That doesn't mean that all biases are the same, because we know that there's certain biases that are systemically supported by society or by an organizational system. And so even though an individual may have prejudice against somebody else, it's different to have a prejudice than it is to have a bias or an ism, as we might say, which is systemically supported. But it's important for us, this is why it's so important for us to remove this sort of good person, bad person fixing mindset. One of the reasons that people are hesitant to get involved in diversity work, there's a powerful sense of diversity fatigue out there, is because so much of it feels like people are having their finger waved at you, and you're being told to, you know, be a better person, and I'm here to fix you. And so things like inviting people from dominant group into these conversations, building a strong business case, getting people to see. It's much easier. When I started doing the work close to 30 years ago now, you know, we didn't have data. Now we have data to show that you know, research shows that you get more diverse people, you get better innovation, you get better problem solving. Research shows that the market shares are shifting, and we know these demographics are changing and need to reach that market share. So it's pretty easy to build a business case now, and to get people to realize this is not for those people, it's for all of us. And that's got to be a constant conversation. And then the second piece of that is for those of us who are practitioners, when we get that resistance, where we're sensing that resistance, rather than point fingers at the resistors and say, why are they resisting, to start asking ourselves the question, what are we doing to contribute to that resistance? What can we do differently to invite them into the conversation? Because it's very easy, and I've been there before. You know, you feel sometimes like you're beating your head against a brick wall when you're trying to get people into the conversation. But it's very easy to make them the problem. But the reality is we must be contributing something for them not to be welcomed into the conversation. And so to find ways where we can get more folks into the conversation so that it's not one group talking to another group, but rather a collective group sharing it with everybody in the organization or the system.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. Howard's going to stick around for a little bit. He'll be signing books right out here if you're interested. And thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you, everybody.